Hey folks, welcome to Harmony Concepts here on the Composer Exchange. And we are today with Stuart. Stuart is going to be presenting on symmetric scales and megascales, which is going to be awesome. Stuart always delivers wonderful, interesting concepts, and I'm glad he took the time to share. Special thanks right now to Piebox and Slack for allowing us to use their tools for our community to learn, grow, share, and collaborate. And without any further rambling on my part, take it away, Stuart, and let's hear what you got to say today.
Thanks, Christopher. Lovely to be back with you guys. Just wanted to share about something that I've been looking at for quite a number of years, and it's the whole thing of megascales. But my take on megascales is that they are related to symmetric scales. So that's why I want to do them both in one session. So let's crack on with it. It's not changed. It's not. That's changed. Can you see that? Yeah. All right. You can see it all. Okay. Now, back in the 1990s, I was fiddling around on my keyboards and I was trying to do a study into consonants. No, not continents, but consonants, as in like things that make that sound good, basically. What makes music sound good? What makes certain chords sound good? And I was doing some reading and I read that the perfect fifth is the most consonant or the most pleasing sounding interval after the unison and the octave. So it's a really pleasant sounding interval. It really sounds good to our ears. And then I realized that the reason why major triads, that's three note chords, sound very consonant is that they form a perfect fifth interval by stacking, first of all, a major third, then a minor third on top of that. And that makes the perfect fifth. And that's why it sounds so pleasing to our ears. But then a thought came to my mind, what happens if you keep on doing that? What happens if you stack a major third and then a minor third and then keep going? So I started keeping going and it extended the chord and it didn't stop. It just kept going and going and going all across the keyboard. And I thought, this is interesting because this is going to sound very consonant because it's all based on fifths. So it's bound to sound good. But it was weird because it involved all sorts of strange notes that wouldn't normally be in the scale. They would clash normally. So this is what I stumbled upon. I believe it's the Lydian megachord. I'm not the first person to have discovered this. There's others that have discovered this before me as well, and since as well. But I stumbled on this beautiful chord. It covered my whole keyboard and had all these out of key notes as well. And I've since realized it was a Lydian bass chord. And I called it a megachord. I didn't know what else to call it. But it actually contains 24 notes before it repeats. And it goes as follows. Sorry if this is a bit loud. This is the chord being played on stringed instruments. Yeah, it's quite amazing as a chord. And I thought, well, maybe it sounds a little bit sort of euphoric or heavenly. It could be used in that sort of score, I suppose, in if someone was having a euphoric experience or a heavenly experience, maybe it could be used for that. But I wondered why it was there and what it was all about. The properties of the chord, it uses 12 chromatic notes, exactly twice. It changes key as you go up the chord. However, it retains the Lydian sound throughout, like the sharpened fourth, the key thing of Lydian. And it can be also viewed as two cycle of fifths placed one on top of each other, with one of them rotated right by a major third. So that's exactly what you're seeing. You're seeing the cycle of fifths twice and one on top of the other. So the thirds in between are the other cycle of fifths, if you like. No wonder it sounds consonant. The chord in its entirety can be also viewed as a symmetric scale. Looking at the formation and use of symmetric scales, therefore will help us to understand this scale more. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to look at symmetric scales. I've put symmetric scales into two different categories. To my way of thinking, there's two types of symmetric scales. I'll call one of them primary and the other one secondary. So first of all, primary symmetric scales. They're formed when you take any interval, apart from the unison or the octave, obviously, but any other interval is game for becoming a primary symmetric scale. All you do is just keep repeating that same interval exactly as it is, i.e. every single semitone. So if you've got a 20 semitone interval, keep repeating 20 semitones going up, and eventually you'll end up at your starting note, not necessarily with 20 semitones, but this example here on the picture is 10 semitones. 10 semitones, if you're going up in semitones like that, it's almost like it's going backwards through a whole tone scale. Eventually, you're gonna end up back on the C. So it starts off on C, and it goes to the B flat, and it goes through different notes, and it goes off your screen to the right hand side. Eventually, that will end up on a C note, and that is your full symmetric scale. And the amazing thing is you can do that with any interval, apart from obviously the octaves, because you know that the basically once you reach the same note, you've finished your scale. Examples of primary symmetric scales. So we've got the chromatic scale, and all the pictures are on the right hand side of each one of these. So if you go up, if you start from C and you go up one semitone, and you keep going up one semitone, this is the shape that you end up with. You're going up in semitones. It's the chromatic scale that we're all aware of. Then two semitones, again, we're aware of that. It's the other picture, just to your right with the number 2 in it. That's the whole tone scale, C, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, C. And we know that's got a sort of dreamy-like quality to it. It's great for dream sequences. 3 semitones repeated, that's minor thirds. You end up with a diminished 7th chord, and it looks like a square on this cycle. Then 4 semitones repeated, you're going to get back to your starting note higher up after just 3 goes, after just 3 notes, C, E, A flat, and then you're back on C again. And that's basically the augmented chord. 5 semitones is the cycle of fourths. So you got this amazing star shape. And basically what you're doing is you're going up a fourth, and you go all around the cycle of fourths, which people are used to doing that all the time in jazz. But that's the shape that you get. And then as we go past that, the next one is the flattened fifth, or the augmented fourth, minor fifth. So you just get a line going from C to F sharp. And then they start repeating themselves in the sense that going forwards is the same as going backwards on the previous one. So if you look on the previous page, all those shapes, they get repeated as you carry on going up semitones. So if you take 7 semitones, which is a perfect fifth, and you keep repeating that, you'll end up going the other way around the cycle of fourths. You'll be going around the cycle of fifths. The same with 8 semitones, that's the minor sixth. That gives you the same as the augmented chord if you read it backwards. But obviously you're going up in far larger chunks. You're going up in 8 semitones, so it's going to go all across your keyboard. But you're going to end up with the same amount of notes before you end up on the same starting note of C. 9 semitones, that gives you the same as like a diminished 7th chord. But again, it will be spread across your keyboard as you go up 9 semitones each time. And then 10 semitones, that gives you the same, it's a minor 7th, it gives you the same as the whole tone scale, but obviously it's a lot bigger than the whole tone scale. Again, it's stretched all across your keyboard. And then 11 semitones gives you the same as the chromatic scale, if read backwards. So you're going up from C to B flat, C to B, but you're going upwards to B rather than downwards to B. You're going up 11 semitones. So it's repeating the same shapes. Obviously, when you get to 12 semitones, that's your octave. So that's not going to be a symmetric scale. It's excluded. But what happens if you go even further? Well, I believe we can go even past the octave. We can go up to 13 semitones, which is a minor ninth. And you might say, well, due to octave equivalence, surely that's the same as the minor second again. But I believe there's a crucial difference. And the difference really is this. Between minor seconds, you can't fit any more intervals in between them because they're a semitone apart. Unless you start to get into the microtonal scales, but we won't get into that tonight. Whereas when you're going up 13 semitones or a minor ninth, think of all the intervals you can, all the notes you can fit in between those two notes. Grammatically speaking, you can fit 12 notes in between them. And I never ever thought I'd use the words grammatically speaking in a sentence. And this is going to become significant as we look at secondary symmetric scales. But for now, let's just stay with primary symmetric scales, which are just one note repeated. The number and nature of primary symmetric scales. Mathematically, there's an infinite number of primary symmetric scales because any interval in theory can be repeated to make a symmetric scale. So you can end up with massive, massive ones. However, in reality, we're limited by human hearing and the notes on our instruments, as well as by the aesthetic limitations of extreme highs or extreme lows. It gets muddy when you go too low, and we can't, it doesn't sound too great when it's going too high because it gets a bit thin. Primary symmetric scales tend to have a dissonant sound unless they're built from fourths or fifths. And they can also sound floaty and unresolved, dreamy or magical, a bit like the whole tone scale. When you hear that, it's a bit of a cliche, isn't it? When someone falls into a dream state in a film, they often play that whole tone scale. They can also sound very tense, like the diminished seventh chord. They're great for horror and for tense scenes and that sort of stuff. But here's the most important property of primary symmetric scales. Every note, and this, you might not agree with this, but I'm going to give it anyway. Every note of a primary symmetric scale, I believe, is a key center, i.e. a tonic in a different key. We're getting controversial now, I know. So symmetric scales exist in multiple keys at the same time. Think of each note in a primary symmetric scale as a one-note scale in a different key, or maybe the first note of a scale in that key. So thinking about this scale that we looked at before, which was 10 semitones, you start off on a C. You're in the key of C. When you go to the B flat there, you're actually in the key of B flat. When you go to the A flat, you're in the key of A flat. When you go to the F sharp, you're in the key of F sharp. Some of you might be thinking, no, I disagree with that. But just bear with me as I go through the extra bits that I've got. And feel free to disagree if you think I'm talking nonsense. But hopefully this will be helpful as we go through. What's the use of primary symmetric scales? Well, the multiple tonics in a primary symmetric scale, they often don't feel stable, the tonics, or they don't often feel very resolved like our traditional view of a tonic. Unless the intervals used to create their scales are made of fourths or fifths, the scales are usually dissonant. When you look at the scale as a whole, you've got usually a dissonant scale. And consequently, the tonics themselves often want to resolve somewhere else. And we don't normally think of a tonic as that, but I just want to give one example of where that might be the case in the modes of the major scale. In the Locrian scale, say B Locrian, the tonic of that would be B, but it doesn't behave very much like a tonic. Due to the dissonance of the mode, or of the scale, you could say, the B tonic wants to behave more like a leading tone than a tonic, and it's almost like a naughty boy. It's there beckoning us to modulate to the comfort of C Ionian, saying, come on, let's get back to C Ionian. And I think that symmetric tonics often behave in a similar way. For this reason, and because Primary symmetric scales are comprised of notes in various key centers. They are great tools for modulating to different keys. And you can see that on that picture. We feel really, really tense. We want to be resolved. Modulating with primary symmetric scales. So C diminished seventh chord, which is C, E flat, F sharp, A, is resolved by moving. So we're going to move this. Move into a major or a minor chord, a semitone above any of the notes in C diminished seventh. And thus it modulates to those keys. So you could modulate to the key of C sharp major, C sharp minor, E major, E minor, G major, G minor, B flat major, or B flat minor. So it's a tool, if you like, using that symmetric scale, which is also a chord. I say it's a scale, but a scale is a chord. It's another way of viewing a chord. The C diminished seventh chord is actually it's a primary symmetric scale, and each note is a tonic, if you view it that way. The same with the C augmented chord, C, E, and G sharp. The C is resolved by moving to a major or a minor chord, a semitone above any of the notes in C augmented, and it thus modulates to those keys. So you can move any of those up a semitone, the C, the E, the G sharp, or like we said about the C, and they will modulate up into a different key because they're almost acting like leading tones that want to resolve upwards. Okay, I'm going to get on to secondary symmetric scales. Secondary symmetric scales are the same as primary symmetric scales. Remember, primary symmetric scales are just one interval repeated. Secondary symmetric scales are filling in the gaps between those intervals. And whatever you do to fill in a gap, you've got to do it on every gap. So here in the example here, we've got a C note, which is, just imagine this is a symmetric scale, like a two note symmetric scale. It's C and it's F sharp. It's the tritone. So that's the most simplest of symmetric scales, is just two notes. So you've got a two tonic symmetric scale, or two tonic primary symmetric scale, and you want to make it into a secondary symmetric scale. So you add a note, the D note after the C, and that's one tone above the C. Well, whatever you do on the first one, you've got to do on the second one as well. So you've got to add the A flat, which is a tone above the F sharp. You have to do this for the scale to remain symmetric. And you've got to keep the same intervals. So if I added that E flat as well, so if we went C, D, and then E flat, I'd have to go F sharp, A flat, and A. I'd have to mirror it in after the next tonic. Whatever note you add between one set of tonics, you must repeat it between any other tonics in the symmetric scale, keeping the same distances for the scale to remain symmetrical. And examples of this would be, we're familiar with the hexatonic scales and the octatonic scales. They're examples of this. They're symmetric scales. And I would call them secondary symmetric scales. Secondary symmetric scales, examples, or an example. For example, take the primary symmetric scale of a C augmented chord. That's a three-note chord, C, E, G sharp. You could turn this into a secondary symmetric scale by adding an extra note, a semitone up from each tonic, as follows. C, you add the C sharp there. It's in the second picture, you've added a C sharp. Then you've got to do the same above the next tonic, which is E. You've got to add the F, a semitone above the E. And the same thing with the G sharp, you've got to add an A, which is a semitone above the G sharp. So this is one way of building a symmetric scale from that primary symmetric scale. But there's other symmetric scales you can build from that primary symmetric scale as well. So another example, using the same augmented chord as a primary symmetric scale, the C, E, and G sharp, would be to add a different note. So in this second one, on the right hand side, we've got a note which is an E flat. Yeah, an E flat. So it's it's 3 semitones above the tonic of C. So you've got to repeat that everywhere. So above the E, you go up 3 semitones and you end up with a G. From the G sharp, you go up 3 semitones and you end up with a B. And these extra notes that we've added are also called sectional scales. And we'll come to that in the next slide. These added notes are not tonics, rather they are sectional scales. And I got that term from Joseph Schillinger, who wrote the mathematical basis of the arts and also the Schillinger system of musical composition. And really what they are is they're notes within the key of the tonics that they follow. So we've added 1 note so far in between the tonics, but we can add more if there's enough room between the tonics to do so. In this way, it's possible to have sectional scales between the tonics with enough notes to write a little melodic motif, which we can repeat after each tonic if we want. And that's one of the applications of this. I just want to draw your attention to the lower diagram on the right. We can see all the yellow ones are the tonics, and all the blue notes are the sectional scales. Together with the tonics, they form a sectional scale. And what you're doing is you're changing key. So I've circled the first 2 notes. They are both in the key of C. I've circled the second 2 notes there in the key of E flat. The next 2 notes are in the key of F sharp, and the last 2 notes are in the key of A. If you like, what they are is 2 note scales in each of those keys, which is a bit weird, I know, but that's the way it sort of works, really. So in theory, you could use this, and you could write a little motif, a melodic motif, going from the C to the C sharp. You know, you could do that, and then you could repeat it going upwards after each one of these tonics. Now note that the blue notes aren't the tonics. They follow the tonics. This is built on the primary symmetric scale of a diminished 7th chord. So it's 1, 2, it's 3 semitones. That's what the primary symmetric scale is. So hopefully that makes some sort of sense so far. How many sectional scales are there? As in how many scales in between the tonics? Well, we don't have to use trial and error to find out all of the possible scales between 2 tonics. Say you've got 1 tonic on the note C, and the next tonic is the note B flat. It's a huge jump between them. You think, well, how many sectional scales could we have in between those 2 notes? Well, the easiest way to do it is by using number bases, but the number base we would use is base 2. I don't know if you remember from maths doing number base 2. Basically, you've only got noughts and ones in number base 2, and when you reach what would be 2, you go across to the next column, and you normally do that from right to left, and you go along the columns. But binary is very useful for music, because you can actually use it for things like chords, and to find out how many notes there are in different. If you have like 10 notes, you can find out how many different combinations of notes you can have with those 10 notes. And you can do it in a way that means you never repeat the pattern. You simply start from 0 in number base 2, and then you just count upwards, and you get every single combination, every pattern. So I've put a link there just in case you're interested to know how that works. And that's from this amazing website by Ian Ring, where he basically gives you every single conceivable scale in an octave, and he uses the binary system to actually give a number to every single combination. And he explains on this link, in a video on this link, he explains how binary works. Mathematically, there's an infinite number of sectional scales because mathematically, it doesn't matter the distance that you have between notes on a primary symmetric scale. You can have any distance and make it into a primary symmetric scale. So therefore, you can have infinite numbers of sectional scales as well, which is amazing because it means that there's scales out there that we've never even heard of or even conceived, which go beyond the octave, which is a bit freaky when you think about it. Anyway, that's a whole new thing of exploration. Using symmetric scales for harmony. So we've got these scales that we can come up with, and you can make your own up. You can make your own primary and secondary symmetric scales up just by creating your own combinations of sectional scales and stuff. But how do we actually use them as harmony? And I believe that there's three main options that we can use. The first option we have is you just make up your own chords and you put them, first of all, just on the, well, you can put them on any of those notes of the scale, and you can play any chord that you make up and you can play them on them and just use them as roots of your chords. The second thing we can do is we can construct our chords from each sectional scale. And then the third way of doing harmony is we can construct our chords from the scale in its fullness, the whole of the scale, rather than from groups. And I'm going to go through those three options now. Option one, this is where you make up your own chords. You choose your own chord and you just play it on the tonics of the symmetric scale. And this will create leaps to different tonal centers in a similar way to Giant Steps by Coltrane. You could also do a similar thing to what Coltrane would do. You could proceed your chords with 2 5s if you wanted. And what you're doing is you're jumping to different tonal centers, but you're using a symmetric scale to do so, a primary symmetric scale to do that. When you think about it, when you're using your own chord, what happens is you're automatically creating your sectional scales yourself. Because if you use a major chord, your thumb will be on the tonic note. Say you've got just 2 tonics, a C and an F sharp, and you play a major triad on the C, then your sectional scale is basically going to be the E and the G. That is your sectional scale. And you might think, well, but that overlaps the other one that I've got. In a sense, it doesn't really matter because you could just be taking advantage of octave equivalents. There could be an extra octave between that C and that F sharp. Your scale might be between the C in one octave and an F sharp in another octave, So you could be doubling it up that way. So it's all relevant. Yeah, go ahead, Sharon.
Yeah, Stuart, I just want to double check on here. Using your own chord, you've got to maintain the same distance between the keys in that chord, correct? In order to come up with the sectional after that. I mean, you're not just saying come up with any 4 chords that don't have any, well-defined intervals between the notes in that chord. You have to maintain what you talked about earlier, right? Maintain
What do you mean?
Constant intervals. Like if you're using a minor third, you've got to follow the minor third all the way up the chord.
Well, initially, there's different ways of doing it. You could just use the C and the F sharp as tonal centers, and you could play the same chord on both. You could play a major chord on both. And it doesn't really matter that your G note is going to overlap the F sharp. Normally it would matter, but in theory you could have made that gap could have been bigger. You could have been using an F sharp in a higher octave to create your primary symmetric scale anyway. So you could be doing it over a wider load of octaves. So it's valid, I think. Is your question, can you change the chords between the notes?
Can you change the intervals between between the notes in your primary chord. I mean, I just thought
Well,
that what you were
can.
saying
So
is
what you'll
kind of
get.
always. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So what you'll get, and we'll come to this in a minute. And well, let me go to the next page because this
Okay.
will help explain it further.
Great. Thank you.
This is still option 1, and there's 4 options, and I've got some sound examples for the first one here. I was going to do sound examples for all of this, but just ran out of time. I'm really sorry. So here we've got a C and an F sharp. It's the most simplest of primary symmetric scales. It's just one interval which splits the octave in 2. In theory, you can play a C major chord on that first C, and you can play an F major chord on, an F sharp major chord on the F sharp, yeah? And that would be your progression. And that's, in a similar way to giant steps. That's what, they're doing with giant steps, but it's obviously a different, it's based on a different primary symmetric scale. So that's your first option. And then this is what it would sound like. And you just keep going between those. So you're using the same chord on both. And I used the notes, the root, the third, the fifth, and I went up to the sixth as well. Now I know the sixth isn't in the chord, but you could improvise on the C major scale, and then you could improvise on the F sharp major scale on the second tonal center. So that's one way of doing it. But equally, what you could do is you could play this is on the second example here. Well, first example here. I'm using major chords, but rather than sticking to the notes in those major chords, I'm improvising on. You see this scale in picture 3. I'm using the notes of that scale to improvise over the major chords. So the notes clash, but it still sounds good. Have a listen. Sounds exotic, doesn't it? And I suppose that's what you do in blues, isn't it? You're sort of bending notes and stuff, and you're using multiple notes. So that's valid, if you like. So you can play your own chord on both of those tonal centers, or you could play a different chord that you make up on the different tonal centers. So have a listen to this. Oh, sorry about that. It didn't work. Oh, I put the wrong one in. Apologies. But what I was playing, it didn't record it properly. On the first one, I was playing a C major chord, and I was improvising with a C major. Then on the second one, I was playing a C minor chord, and I was improvising with a C minor scale on the second chord. So that's valid as well. And you could swap between the two. In theory, what you're doing is you're changing your what's it called? Your sectional scale for effect. You're using different notes for a sectional scale, and that can be powerful as like giving different emotions, So that's also valid. And then I'm sorry, but I haven't got examples for these. But what you could do is you could play a major chord or a minor chord or whatever chord you desire, not only on the tonics, but you could go up and play the same major chord on each of the sectional scales as well. So you start from C and you play C major, then you play C sharp major, then you play an E major, then you play an F major, then you play F sharp major, G major, B flat major, and then a B major. So that's your third option. Your fourth, and what you'd be doing is, it's a bit more tricky because you'll be improvising using the major scale of whatever root you're on. So when you're on the C, you'll be using C major scale to improvise. When you're on the C sharp, you'll be using C sharp major to improvise. So there's a lot of changing. So it's a bit fiddly to do, but it has a different effect. And then the last option is picture 4, and that's where you play a different chord on each of these different places. So, and you make up that chord. So you could play C major on the first note, on the C tonic. On the C sharp sectional note, you could play a C sharp minor scale, or even a C sharp, some sort of other scale. But obviously you've got to stay within that scale for your improvisations. So the sky's the limit, really, with regard to that. But it's different ways of harmonizing these symmetric scales. Option 2, you create your chords from the sectional scales as groups. So I've circled this. This is exactly the same scale again, built upon these 2 tonics. This is the most simple thing, to have 2 tonics, and I've added 3 notes as the sectional scale. And I've put a circle around sectional scale 1 and a circle around sectional scale 2. And what you would do is you would use these scales for your improvisation, as in like 4 notes: C, C sharp, E, F. That would be the scale you'd use for improvising. And what you would do, you'd change that sectional scale 1 into a chord. And the way you'd do that is you would either change it into thirds, stack this scale into thirds, or stack it into fourths. To stack it into thirds, you take the first note, you miss the second note, and put the second note on the end. You take the third note, you miss the fourth note, and put the fourth note on the end. And then you take the 5th note, and you keep doing that, basically. And you know how to do that, because we do that with a C major scale, changing the C major scale into a C 13th chord. It's converting the scale by mixing, by choosing certain notes and skipping another. If you're going to make this into fourths, you take the first note and skip 2 notes and put them on the end. Then you take the next note in the line, and you keep doing that until you turn it into fourths. So what you do, you'd play a chord from your sectional scale 1, and you play the sectional scale 1 in your right hand, and play the chord in your left hand. Then you'd move key centers to your F sharp, and you play that F sharp sectional scale in your right hand for improvising, and you play a chord made from these notes of the C sharp sectional scale, made into fourths or made into thirds, whatever sounds best, really. So if I go over the page, hang on, go over to that page. Oh, sorry, I've got a duplicated page there. This is the same sectional scale 1 on the top picture, but put into thirds. And it doesn't look like thirds, does it? Because this is a huge gap. But basically, this is how you do it. It's in thirds, but it's in thirds for that particular weird scale. So some of these gaps are going to be huge because you skip a note and then put it on the end, and that means it goes up an octave, a bit like you do with a major scale. Remember when you start to go into the ninths, are in a different octave, aren't they? And it's the same with these. It's because it's a smaller scale, the gap is going to the jump up to the next octave is going to be bigger. So that's your chord 1 for your first sectional scale. That goes with this first sectional scale. You play this sectional scale 1 in your right hand, and you play this top chord here in your left hand. And then the bottom picture is the second chord, the sectional scale 2. You play that in your left hand, and you'd use the sectional scale 2 there in your right hand for the melody line. But obviously these are quite tricky chords to play because of, I don't know about you, but I couldn't stretch that far. So you've got another option. You can either just do it on your door if you wanted all the notes. That's a bit like utilizing all the notes is a bit like playing a 13th chord, isn't it? You use all the notes in the scale. But really, you don't have to use all notes. You could just use the first 2 notes for each chord, and that's probably easier, and you get the same effect. Or you could use the first 3 notes. Or you could use note 1, skip note 2, and use note 3 and 4. You know, there's different ways of doing this, different ways of voicing this. Hopefully that makes sense. Here's where it gets interesting. Still on option 2. So you're using your sectional scales for chords and for improvising. But what Joseph Schillinger suggested is delving into polytonality. So before, what we were doing is we were in one key, the key of C, and then we were jumping into the key of F sharp. As we changed chords, we were changing key, and then we're going back to chord 1 again, going back to the key 1 again, then to key 2. But you don't have to do that. With your right hand, you could be in one key, and with your left hand, you could be in another key. And that's where it gets really weird. And that's where, you know, if you want to compose like people like Stravinsky and stuff, that's what they'd be experimenting with. And don't forget that we've got 2 key centers built on this. It's just a 2-note primary symmetric scale. We could have had a 4-note primary symmetric scale with 4 key centers, you know, which means there's different options. You could play in 1 key center with your left hand. If it was if you had 4 tonics, you'd have 4 key centers to play with. So you could vary how far away you were with regard to key centers, and you could get different effects of tension depending on how far the key centers are away from each other. So this is a way to experiment with polytonality. The other option is you could play in 2 key centers at the same time. That's what we're doing anyway. Sorry, I'm getting confused. You're doing that anyway, but I'm confused myself. It is quite deep, isn't it? But on this, you've only got one option, really. You know, you're playing in 2 different keys at the same time. But with larger scales, you've got more options for playing in multiple keys at the same time, and you've got more options about what keys you're using. Let's go on to option 3. Option 3 is that you build your chords from the whole scale. I don't mean the whole tone scale. I mean the full scale that you've got. That means the full symmetric scale, including every single sectional scale, not just one sectional scale, but every sectional scale in the full scale. So you're taking the full scale of your secondary symmetric scale, and you're using every single note to build your chords. It's getting a bit deep, but maybe if we have pictures, it'll be a bit easier. And what this method provides us with more chords. You'll have as many chords as there are notes in the full scale. And each chord is made up by stacking the scale itself, either in thirds or fourths, if thirds don't sound very good, if they're sounding too dissonant, whatever, you know, works best. And again, to stack in thirds, you skip every other note in the scale, or in fourths, you skip 2 notes. Let's have a look at that and see what it looks like in practice. So I'm going to use the same scale as we've been using in previous examples. The full scale would be from the note C, then going up to D flat, E, F, and you're not having a division now, you're carrying on. F sharp, G, A sharp, and B. So you'll start to create chords, not from half of that, but from all of that scale. So your first chord, I've written them down in the second bullet point. Chord 1 would be C, This is if you're doing it in this is if you're doing it in fourths. I decided to do this in fourths because it sounded better, I thought. I wish I had this recorded, but I just didn't get time. But chord 1 would be C, F, and A sharp. So you're taking the C, you're skipping 2 notes, you're going to the F, skipping the next 2, and you're going A sharp, and that's your chord 1. Chord 2, you got to the next note, D flat, skip 2 notes, go to the F sharp, skip 2 notes, and you go to the B. That's chord 2. Chord 3, you start from E, you skip 2 notes, then you've got G, skip 2 notes, and then you've got C again. Chord 4, start from the F, you skip 2 notes and you've got A sharp, skip 2 notes and you've got D flat, and so on. You get the idea. You go through all 8 notes, you'll end up with 8 chords, all stacked in fourths. And what you'd do is you would use whatever chords you chose to make your progression, and you would use the whole of the scale to improvise. And here's an important note. You would use whatever notes you're playing in your chord. They're all taken from the scale, but you would spend more time on those notes. You'd use them as rest notes, and you'd use the other notes of the scale as passing notes or auxiliary tones. So you're emphasizing the notes in your chord, but you're only using notes from the scale to improvise, but you're using notes that aren't in the particular chord you're playing at the time as passing notes or auxiliary tones. We're still on option 3. The entire
Hey, Stuart, those chords sound great. Just I know you didn't record it, but just to let everybody know, play through them. That sounds great.
Yeah, it's and that's just one example of one symmetric scale, and I'm so excited to see what you guys are going to come up with. So thanks for that encouragement, Sharon. The entire scale in the symmetric scale could also be termed as a megascale. So that little ditty there, I'm calling it a megascale, even though it doesn't look very mega. That is what I think megascales are. It could also be termed a megascale, and the full scale could be played, not played, but played either as a scale. You could just play it from start to finish, going up, or as a huge chord. So you could play that in theory as a chord. It's going to sound pretty dissonant because of the small intervals in it. Or as an arpeggio, if the intervals are large enough, or if rearranged into an expanded form. So really, that previous one, we could write that out as the whole scale out in thirds or in fourths, and then you could play it as a megachord that way. That would be a megachord, but it'd be just stacked a different way. Hence, a megachord is either a mega scale stacked in thirds or more, or it's a scale constructed that way. So you could actually start off just, with the scale with bigger gaps between it anyway. With your sectional scales have bigger gaps right from the get-go. It might not sound very mega in the example that we've just seen, but when you build symmetric scales on fourths and fifths and play the full scale, it really does sound mega because it's very, very long. Because what you get, you visit every key in 12 keys, when you're building scales in fourths and fifths. So you end up with really big chords or really big scales. So that's where they come from. The importance of mega chords is that they allow us to extend. Here's the key thing. This is really, really important. The importance of mega chords is that they allow us to extend chords beyond the 13th into the new dimension. And they still keep the flavor of the mode. Jacob Collier explains this perfectly in the video that I've put a link to there. I won't play it because I don't want us to get taken off YouTube. But it's just a 2-minute video, and he plays the chords in a Lydian megachord, and you can hear it. You can hear why it sounds so good, and he basically he explains that you're using notes which you wouldn't normally find in the 13th chord. He uses one note that's an extra note, and you think, well, that's not normally in the 13th chord, but it sounds better than if he'd gone to the octave. And you'll hear it in the video, and it's very convincing. But it allows us to go much further than the 13th, and to have you stack chords, and you end up with like mega chords. Let's go to the next page. This is the C mega Lydian chord or scale. You can either see it as a scale or a chord. And it's the chord that we heard at the beginning of this study that we're looking at. And it's constructed, I believe, from a primary symmetric scale of repeating fifths. So the yellow notes are our tonics. And so all you're doing is you're taking that same fifth interval and repeating it until you get to the C note. And it actually fits on the keyboard, on this keyboard. Start at that low C there. The scale is complete when you reach that C at the top. And this scale, you've just added to this scale one single sectional scale, a major third up from the tonic. So these are your tonics, C, G, D, A, E, just going through the cycle of fifth. And these are your sectional scales, the blue notes. It's a two note scale, basically, the tonic and its sectional scale note, a major third apart. And that's why it sounds so good. Let's have a listen to it. Sounds nice, doesn't it? Okay, just going on to, the other point I want to make is this. This is what Jacob Collier calls super, ultra, hyper, mega, meta Lydian. That's his nickname for it. Because of how the scale is constructed, here's a key thing. Starting from any tonic in the scale will produce a 7-note Lydian chord. So if I was to start from this C note at the bottom, that plays a Lydian chord, a C Lydian chord. But if I was to start from the G note, the next note up, that will play a G Lydian chord. If I was to start from the D, it would play a D Lydian chord. It's amazing, really. So it has amazing qualities. And we're going to look at those qualities now. This is a chart I made up. And on the top line, you can see, you know, like when Tony used to play like a Lydian chord, and he'd play all the notes in a very flashy way. So that's what we're doing. We've got thirds here. We've got the root, which is a C. You've got E as a third, and then a fifth, the seventh, the ninth, and then the sharpened 11th, which is the key aspect of a Lydian. That's the F sharp. And then you've got the A. So that's got this is the notes that we've just seen on the piano keyboard. That is one scale. Then if we start from a G, all I've done is I've taken that combination and I've cut and pasted it, and I've moved it over to the G. And what you can see happens is all of the notes line up. So the root of the G Lydian chord is exactly the same note as the fifth of the C chord. The major third of the G Lydian chord happens to be the major seventh of the C Lydian chord, and so on. And you keep going, and what you realize before too long is that when you get to the A note, I don't know if you can see what in column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Column 7, the yellow column 7, you've got the A note exists in 4 different keys at the same time. And in the key of C, it's going to be the 13th. It's the 13th in C Lydian chord. It's the 9th in G Lydian chord. It's the 5th in D Lydian chord. And it's the root in A Lydian chord. And that's why this is so beautiful, because what's happening is you're going up through the keys and you're keeping that Lydian feel all the way through. And that's why it's so beautiful, because it's a way of stacking the Lydian chord on top of itself and visiting different key centers, but in a way which is gradual. And that's why it sounds so good. So let's just listen to it now. How do we play Lydian megachords? Well, the previous image shows us how different keys connect using notes common to both or multiple keys. Although technically speaking, the Lydian megachord is just a major dyad stacked around the cycle of fifths. This isn't very helpful when you wanted to play a C Lydian megachord. Let's just prove that a minute. Let's go back to, if you look at it, it's just a dyad. It's just a 2-note scale going around the circle of fifths. So you could start on C and play a major dyad, major third, yeah? And then you go up to the key of G and you played a major third. You go up to the key of D and you do the same thing all around the cycle of fifths. That's all you're doing. But that's not very helpful when you're wanting to play chords. And there's different ways of playing chords to get this. You could play Lydian megachords by playing a major ninth sharpened 11 stacked in 13ths. So you play C major 9 sharpened 11th, and then you go to play A major 9 sharpened 11th. That's quite a difficult chord to play. An easier way of doing it, and the easiest way of playing in that scale and having that sound, is what Jacob Collier did on his video. You basically play stacked major sevenths, and you stack them up a tone each time. So you'd play a C major 7 with a D major 7 stacked on top of it. So left hand C major 7, right hand D major 7, and you've got basically a Lydian megachord, but just the start of it. And it's a beautiful sound. It really is. This is what it sounds like. Isn't that nice? It's tasty. It's a very tasty chord. If you were to play the full Lydian megachord, you would have to do that 6 times. You'd have to play C major 7 with D major 7 on top of it, and E major 7 on top of that, F sharp major 7 on top of that, G sharp major 7 on top of that, and B flat major 7 on top of that. And eventually you end up on note C after that. This is what it sounds like. Yeah, quite a tasty chord. But you can see that you've still got the sound of it by just doing two stacked major 7ths. And you can stack as many as you want, really. And you can also choose, if it's sounding too thick, you could get rid of some of the fifths as well, and still keep the sound. Megachords beyond the Lydian. As well as Jacob Collier, Slonimsky, who did that amazing book of the Thesaurus of Musical Scales, he mentions the Lydian megachord, where he calls it the disjunct Lydian polytetrachord. In addition to creating Lydian megachords, it's also possible to create megachords from all of the other modes of the major scale. And I think Tony actually did a video on this where he proves the point and does it as well. Just as the Lydian megachord is, by the way, it's in Spanish though, so you'll have to put the translation on. Just as the Lydian megachord is constructed by playing a major dyad, a 2-note chord, repeated in perfect fifths apart, so Dorian is also constructed the same way, by playing a dyad, repeated perfect fifths apart, but this time, rather than playing a major dyad, you just play a minor dyad each time. But again, stacking dyads isn't an easy task to do, so it's easier to actually play a minor 7th chord stacked and going up a tone each time, just as you did before. So the full Dorian megachord is C minor 7, D minor 7, E minor 7, F sharp minor 7, G sharp minor 7, B flat minor 7. But you could just stack a C minor 7 and D minor 7 to get the sound. And this is what it sounds like. Again, it's a nice sound. Here is the Dorian mega scale in thirds. You can see on the top left, we've got, this is a C Dorian mega scale, by the way. You've got C and an E flat. Then you're stacking it in thirds again. You go into the, you go into the G and put in a minor third from the G, going around the cycle of fifths. This is what it sounds like. That's it as a scale rather than a chord. Not too far to go now, guys. You're doing well. The other modes as mega chords. All of the other 5 modes are constructed by playing ninth tetrads, which is 4-note chords, a perfect 11th apart. So these are a bit more tricky to do. And these, sadly, these produce 60-note symmetric scales rather than just the 24-note scales that we've been fiddling with the Lydian and the Dorian modes. But you don't have to play the full thing. You could just play, like we did before, you could just play 2 chords so to get the sound. So for the Ionian, you can play a major 9th chord separated by 11ths. So you go up to the perfect 11th. So you play in your left hand C major 9 and play in your right hand F major 9. And this is what it sounds like. For Phrygian, you would do the same thing, but you play in your left hand a minor 7 flat 9, a C minor 7 flat 9, and then in your right hand you play an F minor 7 flat 9. And again, you could stack more than that if you want, but you just keep going up in fourths rather than in fifths. So let's have a listen to this second one. And then for the mixed Lydian, you play ninths, a 9th chord. So obviously it's got a dominant 7th in it. So it's C9 and an F9 stacked. So the F9 is stacked on top of the C9, and this is what it sounds like. Oh. And then for the Aeolian, again, you're stacking in 11ths. So you're going C minor 9, and then you're going F minor 9. And this is what it sounds like. Locrian. Oh, hang on. Go back. Locrian, you would play C minor 7 flat 5 flat 9, and stacked on top of that F minor 7 flat 5 flat 9, and you end up with. So quite interesting sounds, aren't they? And we could use these for special effects, I guess, in certain scenes and stuff, for an extra punch and extra impact, perhaps. Stack a couple of these chords above each other, or stack more and omit tones if needed. I've just given you a handy table with all the actual notes in there of the chords. We don't have to do them out of chords in thirds. We could also do them in seconds. It's possible to do all of these scales in seconds as well. So this is the Ionian mega scale stack, but it's constructed in seconds. And you basically play the first 4 notes of the C major scale, and you're in the key of C there. And once you hit the G, you're in the key of G. But it still uses all of the notes of the Ionian scale. So you're still, in a sense, in the key of C, and that's where the beauty comes from. It's actually utilizing that not knowing what sort of key you're in. You could be in one or the other key using these notes. They're ambiguous. That's the word I was looking for. The ambiguity of it. But again, what I did was I took a scale and I took that exact combination and moved it along until they lined up, and they happened to line up on the G. Well, you might think, what's the point of this? Why would you ever use this? Well, you'd use it to modulate without chords. So it's possible to modulate in a scale line. and to visit different keys just by going up in a melodic line. And that could be used for an effect. I don't know where you want to use it, but you could use it. I've given you, just for handiness, all of the modes in a similar way. These are in seconds rather than in thirds. And I did have time to record these. So this is C Mega Lydian. So, hi Bill, thanks for joining us. I won't play all of them, but you can play them. I'll play the Locrian because these all sound quite similar, surprisingly. I guess it's just the way they're played, but so you might be saying, well, Stu, what's the point of that? I'll just note as well that for some of these you have to go up on the G on the fifth. Some of them you have to go around the circle of fourths. That's just the way they stack together as scales. Well, the point of this is, as I said before, you can modulate by just using a single melody line without the use of chords, which is I think could be quite handy in some circumstances. So, and as an example of this, I've taken an Ionian megascale, and I've written it out here. And every time well, first of all, the first note is the tonic, that's C, and you use 4 notes, C, D, E, F. Then the next note is the tonic of a new key, that's the key of G, G, A, B, C. Then every time you see a semicolon, you're going into a new key. That's the tonic of a new key, but it keeps the Ionian scale. So if you go C, D, E, F, G, A, B, you've got an Ionian scale as well. So it's that ambiguity of you're in 2 keys at the same time, in a sense. So it's using that ambiguity to travel through the keys, but it's doing it in a scalar fashion rather than in a chord fashion. And so, for instance, if you wanted to go from the key of C to C major to the key of A major, what you do is you go along that scale and you look for an A note that is in tonic position. So after a semicolon, you can see that the underlined bold A is there. So what you would do is you would play in a scalar fashion. You'd start from C, you're in the key of C, you play all those notes, you'd go past the A note and go to the end of its sectional scale. So you go play the note A, B, C sharp, D, but you wouldn't play the E because that's in another tonal center. Then you would descend again, go from D to C sharp to B to A, and then you're on that note as a tonic. So in theory, it should work. I'll leave you to be the judge as to whether it does work. So what I've done in the example, I've played a chord of C, but then I've gone up the scale of C and done just as we've said, all the way past the sectional scale of the key center of A, and then descended upon scale-wise, descended upon the A, and then I finished with a chord of A major to finish, just to prove that we're in a different key. You might think it works, might think, oh, it doesn't work very well, but here's the example. You're now in key of A. So shall I play it again just to get hear it again? You see, key of A. So it's a modulation device, and that's the beauty of these symmetric scales is that you can use them for modulation purposes. We're so used to scales which stop at 1 octave. However, with symmetric scales being able to be made from any repeating interval, no matter how large, it creates a whole vista for sectional scales greater than the octave to be created. So that, in my mind, that blows my mind that there's like multiple octave scales that could be used to create music. I don't know what that would sound like. It's an unsort of tapped area perhaps. It turns out there is theoretically no mathematical limit to music, but obviously there is a limit by the human ear and the limits of instruments, etc. But mathematically, it's infinite. In turn, the megascales which can be developed are also infinite. It seems that there's a vast area of music that we've not yet explored. Your challenge: explore symmetric scales and try to incorporate them somewhere in your music. Try particularly to see if you can make a motif and repeat it at different tonics in a symmetric scale. See if you can modulate using a symmetric scale. Why not try polytonality, where you break up the sectional scales and play them as chords, but use a different sectional scale within the same symmetric scale. So you play in two different keys at the same time, as we said earlier. Have a go at extending a chord beyond the 13th by making it extend into its first few megascale key centers. For example, extend G7 Mixolydian chord by playing G9 with C9, and if you want to feel bold, put an F9 on top of that. So you're stacking the C9 on top of the G9 and stacking the F9 on top of the C9, just to make a mega chord. Have fun with it. Okay, I think that's me done. Any questions? Sorry, it's been such a lot of stuff to try and digest. Yeah, go ahead, Sharon.
Yeah, this was great, Stuart. Really, really interesting. I like that you break us out of the common mode of standard harmonies and stuff. So really, really interesting. I appreciate all the time you put in on it. I'm sure it
Thanks,
was a
Sharon.
ton of work. But I wanted to ask you: are you aware of any like modern film composers that use this? I mean, it does sound avant-garde, and Stravinsky and some of the guys from the early 20th century. I could see them playing
Yeah.
around with it. But are you aware of any, like, other than Jacob Collier? Obviously, seems like he knows a lot about it. But
Well,
any other?
to be honest, when we were looking at John Williams, we were using it was either the octatonic or hexatonic or both, and it's this theory, and it's what John Williams does quite a lot. Is he'll play the same motif and he'll go up the different tonal centers above the tonics and play that same motif. And yeah, I suppose it's well, William would be the person to ask on that scale. I know Stravinsky, was into very much polytonality and stuff, and perhaps John Williams got some of his ideas from composers like Stravinsky.
Oh, certainly. Williams was heavily influenced by Stravinsky.
Yeah,
But two guys that come to mind just off the top of my head would be Jerry Goldsmith, and then Elliot Goldenthal.
yeah,
Doesn't do a lot of films, but he's more of a concert composer.
Okay.
yeah,
But if you listen to the score for um, the third Alien movie, I think it's Alien 3, I think it's called. I can't remember. Alien Resurrection or something, I can't remember. That's Goldenthal. Don Davis uses a lot of symmetrical scales in his Matrix scores.
yeah.
Okay.
All right, nice.
Tends
Yeah,
to
because
do
that gets into polytonality, doesn't it, with the
He tends
Matrix?
to do it in more of a kind of a cellular fashion,
Mm,
using the scales and then creating cells that then he moves around and plays with and
mm.
stacks on top of each other. Um, but yeah, there's definitely it's definitely been pretty widely used because it does tend to lend itself to kind of a harmonic ambiguity
Yeah,
and gives the composer a lot of freedom to move where they need to move to you know tell whatever story they're trying to tell.
Yeah.
Great. Thank
But
you.
yeah, yeah. I mean, Williams. Williams is probably the king of using it and making it sound accessible.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Because a lot of Jerry's stuff is so brilliantly written, but it's not necessarily something that you would sit down with a cup of tea and listen to,
Hmm.
right? Particularly his
Right.
underscore stuff. He was, of course, he was able to write big themes and all that kind of stuff, but his underscore tends to be a little bit more modern sounding. Goldenthal is definitely a modern classical composer. Don Davis is a modern classical composer.
Yeah.
They're brilliant composers. They really are. I mean, the
Right.
Matrix score is something that you could analyze for years.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Stuart,
guess any links to examples would be appreciated.
Oh yeah, I can
We're
do
able
that.
to, yeah, that'd
that would
be
be
great.
awesome. If you could
I'd
put
tell
that
you
in the
that
Harmony chat, that would be great.
I would tell you guys that if you really want some really interesting listening, if you can get a hold of the collection of Alien movies.
Hmm.
I think it was originally called the Quadrilogy or something like that. Um, Either on the DVDs, or I think the Apple TV iTunes version has with the iTunes extras has the extras. The first three movies have isolated scores. And the first movie actually has the original score that Goldsmith wrote that was then rewritten. And then years later, Ridley Scott went back and basically said, oh yeah, that first score actually was much better. but you can hear his score, James Horner's score for Aliens, and Goldenthal's score for Alien 3.
Hmm.
It's pretty interesting.
Awesome.
Look forward to studying that. Thanks so much, William.
Well, first of all, hey, welcome back, William. We miss you. We love you. Okay.
Yeah.
I hear we hear you're working on some big stuff. I'm going to stop the recording so you can hint at it without giving away your NDA agreement. Anyways, thank you everybody for participating. Stuart, great presentation. This is really going to be a fun exercise, and we're going to be back next week making some cool music and listening to what we all come up with. That. Thank you to Piebox and Slack for allowing us to use their tools. Everybody wave goodbye, and then we'll be off of the line.